Hi YouTubers, welcome back. As you may have noticed, we have a new logo/intro now. I hope you like it. We also have an Instagram account set up that I will use to publish additional photos and maybe short video sequences to go along with the videos I post here. So go check it out and give feedback. For today's episode, we will focus on what the plan is for the garage rebuild. I want to walk you all through the process from idea to plan to execution. After I started the demolition, I also sat down and thought about how I would want to rebuild the garage. For that, I used a tool called Home Designer Pro 2018. I had used it before when I came up with the plans for my house remodel, and it makes it really easy to then quickly share those plans with the actual architect and for them to draw up the actual plans. Now, when you do your own plans, you may not take certain aspects into account that are related to code or just good practice in general. That's really where the architect comes in and helps set all that straight. Your plans will likely also not take any static calculations into account, unless you're a structural engineer by trade maybe. So he will involve the engineer to ensure the building will structurally be safe, and that may mean small adjustments here or there. So in my case, I started out just drawing up the plans, as you can see here. The overall dimensions of the new garage are 19 feet by 22 feet. A little side note on these dimensions. When you measure the old dimensions, make sure you write them down if you can't keep them correct in your head. Or measure again to be sure. Because in my case, for whatever reason, I remembered 19 by 22 feet, but in reality, the old garage layout was just 18 by 22 feet. And I didn't even realize my fault until after I had the plans back from the architect and they'd been submitted to the city for approval. So that meant for me to hire a surveyor to precisely remeasure the property lines. And lucky for me, I had 17 inches from the old wall on the neighbor's side to the actual property line. The extra foot got us exactly to the line where the fence was installed. The neighbor was okay with that, and so I didn't have to get the plans changed and resubmitted. But still, $1,200 later. So back to this. The new garage will be partitioned into 4 rooms. My new office on the lower left with its own access door, a new home theater in the top left corner, a storage room in the top right corner, and the main garage/workshop space in the lower right. But the home theater and the storage space will be accessible via pocket doors, so they can't just disappear in the wall. The attic will also be the main storage area and will be accessible via the garage part. Overall, the layout is very similar to how the old garage was laid out, just with the additional attic space and the back room connecting to the office instead of the garage. All the red markers you see along the walls are power outlets. The red circles in the middle of the rooms are recess lights, and the red dollar signs are switches. And there are also some outside lights and some 220 volt outlets over here. So here we see a full perspective overview of how the garage is supposed to look like when it's done. And you'll see later at the actual architectural diagrams that the roof direction changed. Right now it's sloping towards the garage door. In the final plans, it's actually the other way around. But it gives us a pretty good idea on what the long-term plan is. Here's the side door to the office, the garage part, little storage room in the back. This is the side to the neighbor, back side. So I really like playing with this. It gives me a really good idea of what I'm looking at. And then here we see the dollhouse view of the same thing. So we can look inside, access to the attic from the garage section, probably some storage around here. All my tools are eventually going to go here. There's a little storage area here in the back. This is also where all of the electronics are going to go. This is going to be my new office. Nice wraparound desk. PC in the corner. Some shelves. This is the entrance door, and this is the door to the new home theater. And this is a pocket door. And then you have the home theater in the back, nice and dark. Play here. And then for all of this, the audio sound system and the playback devices and so on, they're all going to go on this side of the wall. So this way they're out of the way. And again, right, so this gives me a really good idea of what the dimensions are going to be like and how this roughly is going to look like when it's done. And this is what the plans look like once we get them back from the architect. Some general information about the project, some code information, the proposed site plan. So here's the electrical plan. It looks similar to what we saw before, but much less detailed. The other thing I want to point out at this point is that once I talked to the architect about the overall plan, he suggested to instead do a simplified build that we submit to the city. I can always add additional interior walls later, but this just makes the whole submission process much easier. And so this is all of the layout now with the actual dimensions on where everything is placed. This can be a little confusing, especially if you've never looked at something like this before. So we see the ridge line is right here in the center. There's some measurements that are in here, like the complete width and height, and then some distances. And so it's up to you as the builder to basically determine the actual dimensions of a lot of these specific pieces where the walls really sit. What we do know is things like, okay, the center of this window, for example, is equidistant from this wall and from this wall. The distance on each side here is exactly the same distance here as it is from this wall. This dimension is actually wrong. This should be 5 inches. And then it also gives us some additional pieces where I can look in the plan on page S9, and then there's diagram A4.1 that gives me some additional information on these points. Here we see some side views of the new building. Again, more information. For example, here we see the angle for the roof. This is the height of the first floor, basically from the ground to the top plate, and then the total height of the roof. This is also really important because at least for San Jose city code, the garage cannot be taller than the main house. And so my house is 15 feet tall. So the peak of the roof of the ridge can't be taller than 15 feet either. So here we see some things that become really important later in the build. For example, that there's a header here that spans across the entire length of the window and the garage door. So there's not two separate headers, it's one single header, because this also holds a lot of the load and it gets basically transferred down on this post, down actually this post here. There's a post here, and then there's the gable window, which transfers the load from the ridge beam on this header down on these two posts, and then transfers that down onto this header again. And there's posts here, here, and we see that in a later diagram better. Again, there's also a cross beam that holds the center of this building, and there's a center post in the middle of the ridge beam. So this is the foundation plan now, and here we see some other information too. So for example, these are stem walls, everything around here. The squares with the X's are posts where most of the load is residing on. And then these little dots, they're hold down anchors. When I hired the concrete contractor to pour the foundation, I assumed that that contractor will know exactly what to do based on this information here. And that's partially true, but typically the contractors that do the concrete, they rely on the framer to give them certain information. Since I didn't know that, I didn't pay attention on some things that then later turn out to be problems. And we'll show that in a later point. But essentially, the things you want to look out for is these openings for doors, that they're wider than what the actual door width is going to be. And you have to pay really a lot of attention to where the location of these hold down anchors are, because the hold downs are typically mounted against these posts that you see here. And so if the hold downs are not located precisely, or like within like basically half an inch of where the post wall is going to be, you're going to have a lot of problems mounting those. And I will show you in later videos what that meant for me ultimately, because not all of these ended up in the right position, at least not completely. The other thing that this doesn't show is where the rest of the anchor bolts go. It talks a little bit about it here, but essentially you want to have kind of a lot of anchor bolts. Typically, I would say one every foot or so. But there's also, based on your city or county code, as to how far these anchors need to be away from each edge of a base plate. And the base plate is basically the bottommost lumber piece that connects with the concrete stem wall here. The other thing we see, there's some reinforcement here for that interior wall to give it some additional stability down, which will be nice, because then if I put something heavy here, there's concrete underneath it that really supports if there's anything heavy underneath. This is the plan now for the actual framing. And again, it gives us more details on a lot of those posts and the hold downs. For example, the HDU4s here, and there's HDU2s here. That tells us essentially, and let me zoom in a little more maybe, that tells us basically what type of hold downs need to be used. HDU4s are a little heavier than the HDU2s. And the other thing to know is that these hold downs are typically used in conjunction with the shear wall. So that's those striped lines here. Those are shear walls over here, down here, and then on this side. And the shear walls basically ensure that the wall doesn't move laterally, because they're all, think of all of the studs are going straight out of the picture, just straight up. So if you were to push from here, or you were pushed to push from here, there's really nothing to prevent those studs from moving. And that's what those shear walls are basically doing. They're nailing all of this together really tightly so that the studs have nowhere to go laterally. And you do this basically on each direction. So this way, overall, the building becomes really, really stable. The other information that's here is there's two beams. So there's basically a drop beam through the center of the building that is on top of the first floor. And that holds also this post here, which then holds the ridge beam, which goes from here to here. And so the ridge beam is basically held up in 3 points, down here, up here, and in the center. And then the post rests on that drop beam here. And drop beam just means that the beam drops into the ceiling. So it's not flush with the ceiling. So if you stand on the inside, this beam will basically show because it's lower than the rest of the ceiling. The other information that we're going to be able to read out of here is where the ceiling joists go. Those are all of these that go from top to bottom, and where the rafters go from left to right. And it tells us here, for example, that we use 2x8s Douglas fir #2 ceiling joists at 16 inches on center. So every 16 inches, we're going to have one ceiling joist, and that connects on the top plate, and in the middle on that drop beam, and then same for the other direction. The rafters, on the other hand, they are described here. So it's 2x6s Douglas fir #2 at 24 inches on center. And then the last piece that is in here too is the information about where the opening for the attic is. Now I changed that later down the road, made it a little bigger so that I can actually get large boxes up and down. That just meant that I had to reinforce how this opening is done. This one, the U28, is essentially the hanger that those ceiling joists are connecting to the drop beam here. So if we go up here, we also see the shear wall schedule. So the shear wall schedule is basically for each of these walls. You see there's like a P1 or a P2 here, P1, P2, what drywall material or shear wall material we need to use, how it's being nailed. So basically 8D nails at 16 on center or 12 on center. There's some clips that need to be added and how they connect to the sole plate. Here is the beam schedule. So I was talking about the two beams. It's actually kind of three because you have the drop beam, which is one solid beam, pretty big, 5¼ inch by 11 7/8 inch PSL. So that's pressed lumber essentially. And that sits on 4x12 header on the left side. That's right above the door here. And it sits on a 4x6 post on the right, and that is achieved with this ECCQ64. That ECCQ64 is basically an end column cap with 6 inches on the top where the beam rests and 4 inches on the bottom where the post is. This is the drop beam information that I was talking earlier. It basically drops into the ceiling at about 4 inches. And then there's some additional information on how the beam is connected into the rest of the framing. And then for the ridge beam, those are two beams that meet at that center king post that I was talking about earlier. And so you got basically an end column cap on one side, and then on the other side, it's a end column cap over the header that is done here because there's that attic window. And then in the middle, it's just center column cap. So it just goes right through the center of it. And so the rest of the plans is then excerpts from the code as to how a lot of the framing is being done. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail right now, just because we'll come across a lot of this once we go into the actual framing videos. I'm just going to show it for completeness real quick, and then more information on the code as to how to build, how to nail, and so on and so forth. And that's all of the plans. Well, that gives you a good idea of what is to come over the next few months. I will refer back to the architectural plans a lot, especially during framing. I really appreciated a lot of the framing related diagrams in the back of the plans as they helped me understand how to build some specific parts of the garage. But I also ran into some challenges that I did not foresee. The plan certainly will not be the end of all information for a project like this. In my case, I also had a friend who just recently became a general contractor to explain to me some of the less obvious items. So having someone like that will be like gold if you were to attempt this yourself. Other resources include, of course, YouTube, as well as books on the topic of framing and construction. I'll link some of them in the description of this video. Should you have actual architectural plans? Usually you need them, but it depends. First, check your local code. For owner builders like me, you can often get away with a lot of things that general contractors may not. But is that the best way of building a garage like this? I don't think so, if not impossible. You're certainly much better off getting proper plans, just for the structural sanity of your construction alone. But it's also not cheap to get an architect involved. Depending on your location, the complexity of the construction, and probably some other factors, the plan will cost you several $1,000s. That's for peace of mind and for ongoing support and availability for your questions, and if needed, for the building inspector's questions or feedback. So for the architectural plans and paying the city for the permits, we're now looking at a $10,000 bill. And let me use this opportunity to also quickly go over the cost of demolition, since I forgot to do that in the last video. Disposal fees For all lumber, concrete, and other material, I paid $1,250 total. Renting the breaker and the dump trailer amounted to about $800. Also, I had to set up a temporary garage for all my stuff while the garage isn't ready, which set me back about $500 in total. And finally, printing the plans was $280. With the survey I mentioned earlier, that brings the grand total spent so far to $14,115.38. That's before we started rebuilding anything. So as mentioned in the beginning of this video, we have an Instagram account set up now, which will give sneak peeks into future episodes until we are caught up to today. The link is here and in the description. Next time, we'll be covering the new foundation and what learnings I took away from that. Until then, please subscribe and like this video. Please also leave a comment with feedback. So long.